To build our picture, we're going to start with the sky first, and then the sand, and then we're going to overlap and finish with the water last. Hi, I'm Laura Gutzwiller. I am here at LivingFelt Studio, and I am here to teach a sunset beach scene, one of my absolute favorite things to create. This is the scene that I will be teaching, and it's all needle felted, and we're using a variety of different fibers, a lot of different types of wool and silk, and some fibers that maybe you've never needle felted before, like bamboo top, and it'll be really fun. There will be a kit available as well with all of these colors for you. To make our beautiful beach scene, we are starting on a piece of wool felt, and then we're using a blend of beautiful fibers. Our base layers are here, starting with the purples. This is a blend of what we've got Maori, we've got Bergschaf, we have a merino blend, and then over here, these are our highlight accent colors that are also going to provide some depth. We have some MC1, but as well as mostly Maori over here as well. And these fun fibers are a blend of, we have got tussa silk, bamboo top, and these are going to be really fun highlight colors that add shine to the waves and along the shoreline. For needle felted pictures, the tools I like to use are the Wow mat, which is very dense, and then I use the topper. This is a 9x9 topper, and the reason why I like using the topper is because I use rather aggressive needles, and this really helps just give it a little more cushion while I'm working. So the specific tools that we're going to use are the clover pen. This is a righty tool. I'm using the punch it tool and then some fiber shears. And specifically, I have a combination of needles that I really enjoy using for each one. So for the clover pen, I have a combination of a 42 triangle, a 40 spiral, and then a 38 spiral. And then in my righty tool, I have the 38 star spiral. And then in the punch it tool, I have a combination of mostly 42 triangle, and then I use 3 40 spirals in there, and I actually like to take one out just so it goes in and out of the fiber a little easier for me. So the shears will be used infrequently, but just to work with some of the silks later on to snip those a little bit. To build our picture, we're going to start with the sky first, and then the sand, and then we're going to overlap and finish with the water last. All right, so let's start with this light purple, and I like to layer on thick. So the first thing I do is overlap the edges about 1/4 inch, just so you don't see any of that white wool underneath, and smooth it out or try to pull it until it's as smooth as possible and really stretched out. We're going to work in thirds for this picture, so we're going to go about 1/3 of the way down. Then the next color is this smoke color. This is all Maori, and I like to take a little tuft of it and spread it out in my fingers and lay it down soft. So we're not even going to use the needles yet. We're just going to start designing what the sky and that sunset looks like first. So I'm taking little pieces and little dabs of it here and there will be time later to add more if it doesn't quite turn out exactly how you want it. So next, this violet color, this beautiful violet. I like to use this down towards where the horizon's going to be, like these clouds are in the shadow over here. So I tore off a little piece, again going a little bit over the edges, but being aware of where the edges are. I like to take my hands and just kind of feel where the edges are lining up. And then I take a little bit up here, like that cloud is raising up a little higher. And then this deep blackberry, a tiny amount of that along the edges, along the top edge of that violet. So little wispy pieces. And I keep these dark colors down towards the horizon, but you can layer those on top of some other things later, so we'll come back to that. And then just the tiniest little bit of this evening color right along the very bottom. So not very much, just these little pinches, and that is actually your first base layer. Take pieces of onion Maori and highlight some parts of that cloud that you started with, but try not to overthink it. Just put little pieces down, highlight the bottom edge. Next, I'm going to start layering the oranges into the sky, and what I like to do is use small pieces, smaller the better, just to start creating wispy details, just like how clouds look, and kind of in like a semicircle towards the horizon, so that when the sun goes in, these are the pieces that are going to reflect from the sun. So starting with those darker oranges, and sometimes I'll go back and put darker pieces underneath some where the shadows would be. So in my head I'm always thinking about where light is going to be hitting, and every sunset's different, but it's nice to have an idea of where the brightest part is going to be and how it's going to move upward. So next, using some lighter yellows and keeping it really wispy and pulling it apart. Sometimes when something's pilly, that looks even better in clouds, just the tiniest little specks here and there where it'll catch the light, moving towards the brightest part of the sky where the sun will be. And using those hottest tones, the really bright yellows, and just piling it on top before I even touch it with the needle. Adding little highlights on some of those lower clouds as well. You can always go back and smash parts of it down and add more too. Like up in the upper part of the sky here, where maybe some clouds were coming forward. And the lightest yellow right around where the sun is going to be. Right where the brightest light is hitting the clouds. And then it's time for the sun. So I roll it in my hand a little bit to make a little ball, depending on the size of the sun that you want in your piece. And we'll refine the edges of that later, but just stick it down so that you have a visual. And then using some brighter pieces to highlight right around the sun. Now we can start felting with our multi-needle tool. And I have my other hand holding it down, which is kind of scary, but just it holds the fiber in place so that it doesn't move around too much when you start pushing down. And be light about it, just straight up and down. Try not to catch too much of it with the needles. But this is when you can also, if you want to, move a couple things around and just keep pressing it down into your backing. And this will take the most time to just smooth out and just get all of the fibers felted in place. Focusing on the edges. And then using the single needle to refine the edges of the sun. I like to tuck it under a little bit and turn it more into a circular shape. Sometimes I'll take that single needle and go along the edges of the clouds and poke parts down so that they look a little more like a cloud shape. What I'm doing here is pulling forward some things that got a little covered up when I pressed it all down, and this always turns out different. You can play around with it, and you can add a couple more colors here if you want. And then continuing to refine the edges. So always be aware of where the edges of your wool felt are. Added a little more pink up here in the sky. It's fun to play around with all these sunset colors. And continue stabbing and felting it down tighter. Just continues to smooth it out. So now that we've felted it down quite a bit, and it'll stay on when you peel it off the backing, this is where I like to fold over the edges and use your multi-needle tool to just stick it down as close as you can to the edge of the wool felt. So just keep needle felting right along the edge, lightly and not too heavy. If you poke too heavy, sometimes it goes through to the front. So just enough to get it to stay. And same thing with the top, just fold it over. And continue felting it down after folding it over the back. All right, so next, before we move on to the sand and the next step, all we're going to do is take a little piece of this bamboo top, or this really shiny white, and add a couple little highlights into the sky. And what I like to do is use my 38 star spiral and just kind of follow where where a cloud would be peeking through here. And that light from the sun is just catching right along the edge of it. So the more that you stick it in deeper, it'll almost make it three-dimensional looking in places. And take wispy little pieces, so not too much. Sometimes less is more. And sometimes you can't even see where it is until the light catches it later. But I'm moving my needle just kind of up and down, and I'm pulling the fiber in different directions and just kind of playing along with where the edges of the clouds are. Just like that. You can smooth that out later or add more. The shore is very simple. We're using mostly this color of MC1 and laying it down just like we did for the sky, overlapping the edges and smoothing it out. So you can either take one big thicker piece and spread it out, or you can do what I'm doing and take little pieces just to fill in empty spots. But again, we're working in about the bottom third. And I like to create an angle just for the visual composition where the shore will come up from the bottom. So starting with that layer, and then going into this blend, which has a nice kind of reddish burnt orange color to it, laying it down almost directly under where those clouds are that have some orange. Oops, stuck to my thumb. There we go. And lastly, using this lighter sand color right in the bottom right corner. Now you can use the dark brown if you want to, just to add little pieces, almost like there's shadow from a sand dune or footsteps, or just places where the light isn't hitting. Just to create a little depth over in the right corner. And then actually let's tap that down first with our multi-needle tool here and get it down just enough so that it doesn't move around. So just a few times. And then using the mushroom color to fill in the space where the water is going to be coming up onto the edge. So finishing that bottom third of your piece. So that's the next part there, and then just tap that down. I try not to overthink it and just get that color down as a guide for where the water is going to be. And then the fun part is using these bright oranges, and we're going to use some of the silks later, but right underneath where the sun is setting. So the reflection of the sun is going to be a vertical line, so that these orange colors are going to be directly underneath that and kind of spread out. But we'll get into a little more of that detail in the last step. So spreading those out. Some of that will be layered and colored up and covered up, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Just a little hint of that sun hitting the sand where it's wet. Like that. And just like before, we'll tuck under the edges. The next part is super simple. My favorite part here is taking about an inch strip of the merino silk blend in the Three Rivers, and it's got such a nice variation to it already. So you can pick it apart if you want to and just, find the colors that can pull out from it and just lay it horizontally about over that whole third. And I like to overlap a little bit, so that there's no backing showing, and then just stick it down. And I know that's kind of thick, but we'll be stabbing at it for a while, so it will start to hold down. So go across it a few times horizontally. I like to go horizontally so you're not pulling the fibers different directions, and it just stays looking like water if all those long fibers are going the same direction. And then push into the edge just a little bit here and get that to stick down. And you can do this for a few minutes until it's as smooth as you want it, or you can kind of leave it just like this, because we're going to add some other colors and layers and waves on top of it. So, you know what? I came down a little too far, so I'm just going to pull a little bit of that off. And then flip over your piece, and if you want to, you can trim some of this off so it's not too bulky behind your piece, but just enough so that you can pull it over the edge, just like we've been doing, and stick it down. Your multi-needle tool. All right, easiest step of the whole thing. Time for the fun part with all of the effect fibers. This is where we get to play around with really shiny pieces of bamboo top and silk. So what we're going to start with is this silk merino blend, a in spice, and it's got so many awesome colors already in it. And I'm just gonna pull off the tiniest little bit, and I'm going to lay it down right where I want it. So this is the piece of the shoreline where the wave is just starting to come up onto the sand here. And it just starts blending, it gives me a little visual guide of where that first wave is going to go. So I barely used any of it. And then I'll use my bigger handled tool here to push that down. Okay, next I'm going to use this. Now I'm going to use the light colors first and then use the dark colors last. So oranges first. This orange is going to really highlight where the water is coming up on the shoreline. And I have this little trick that I like to do where I twist it a couple times first. So it gives me a little wormy shape. And then I can kind of guide it with my 38 star spiral needle along the shore. And the more irregular it comes out, the better. I think it looks more natural when you just let it wiggle and move around and do its own thing. So I'm kind of twisting it with my left hand and or whichever hand you're using holding the fiber, and then stabbing down wherever it feels like going with the other hand. So right along there underneath where you had that dark orange wool. And I might come back and add a little bit more later, but that's about enough of that color for now. Then you'll be using the yellow bamboo top, which is super shiny, and it's a little bit too much. Adding a couple of those little pieces right alongside the orange ones. So the more delicate you can make it, I think the more natural it looks instead of bigger pieces, but everyone has their own style of creating water and edges, so whatever happens, just let it do its thing. So there's a little bit of that yellow. Okay, then to give us a visual guide of the first wave, we're going to take a kind of a bigger piece of this bamboo top. I believe it's turquoise. And just like I did before, I'm going to twist it a little bit and I'm going to lay it down. And instead of pulling the whole piece across all the way, we're going to focus a thicker part over on the left. So it'll visually look like the wave is starting to crest and fall away at the edge there. So you keep it twisty, and then I just stab at it in kind of random places at first, and keep twisting it and maybe adding a little more over towards the thinner edge, twisting it, layering it. And the more I twist it, I think the more realistic it starts to look, like that water is tumbling over itself right there. Don't feel that getting there. Okay, so that's our first visual for the rest of this right here is where that water is going to pull up onto the edge. So you can add another wave in the distance if you'd like to, or two, or maybe a slightly thinner piece because it's in the distance. So adding another twisty little wave back there. And maybe even a really tiny one. That was pretty tiny. Underneath this guy. Alright, we'll leave it there for now until we start smoothing it out more. Alright, now for the shoreline part here. This is where it's really fun because it'll start looking like water is just peeling back from the sand. So I'm going to start with a little bit of dark purple, which seems a little unusual, but visually it's going to pull your eye from the little purple edges of the sky that we created earlier. So here we go, twisting it again. And I secure one part of it right along where I want my edge to be. And if you took a piece that's a little too long, you can either snip it off there, or what I like to do is just pull it back. I like to grab onto it and either dig it in a little deeper or just wrap it back around my main piece. All right, and then we're gonna wiggle it and we're gonna pull it towards where that wave is. So up and down a couple times until you hit the bottom of that wave. And then you can either just leave it off to the side and tuck it under later, or snip that piece off, or hide it underneath there. So we're going to do that a couple times. And we're going to do this with multiple different colors until it really starts to look dimensional. So a couple more of these darker pieces. Every time I do this piece, it turns out a little differently, which is really fun. And you can even take a little bit of it and put it into your main ocean here. Like it's the reflection from those dark purple clouds. So maybe just a couple pieces on the sides. Like that. And then I like to take I like to return to the lavender wool that we started with as that base layer of the sky, and add a little bit of that in there too. And you don't have to twist that as much, just add a couple little squiggles of it. I almost guide it with my needle. Like you can kind of see I'm holding a little strip of it in my left hand, and my needle is just kind of following my hand and catching it. Like that. Okay, next comes some yellow. So same thing, twist, and maybe try making some of these a little thinner, a little smaller. Catch them right under. So we're kind of lining up that yellow where most of the yellow was in the sunset. Ooh, that piece came out really nice. That's already squiggly. And pulling it up. I'm just going to do a couple of these. There. And then this yellow is what's really going to reflect the sun on the water. So you can snip a little bit of this if you want for shorter pieces, if that's more manageable, maybe like 2 inches, maybe a little longer than that. And these blends have so many different colors in them. So this other end of the bamboo top has a little bit of a lighter color to it. That's what you're going to put underneath the sun. So I'm going to switch to my multi-needle tool. Sorry, my head's in there. And stick that down there. And then use some of that brighter yellow, catching the top of where that wave is. So waves that are going to catch the lightest colors from that sunset because they're higher above the water. So you can take a little bit of it and go into the top of this wave here on the shore, right along the edge, and maybe a little more in here. Or if you'd rather use an orange there, you can go back to your orange that we used on the sand. And let me snip that. And add a little bit of orange there. I think the more colors, the better. The more that you can sneak in there and try to reflect what was going on in the sky, I think that just looks really cool to have little glimmers of it where it's catching swells and tiny waves that aren't as big as these other waves in front. Okay, I've got a little bit of a hole there that I need to fix. I realize that, so I'm going to add a little more of that mushroom color and hide that right there. And then we're going to finish with the last two colors, this darker blue and really bright white. So these are going to create some really, really nice depth to the piece. And you can even use black. You could use the dark brown that we had before. It's up to you. But I'm going to start with the dark one, then finish with the lightest color. So the dark, dark blue, I like to put right along the horizon here. And then sticking it in with my single needle. So whenever you can use a very dark color, it creates a good separation, a nice defined line between your water and sky, or depending on the piece you're working on. But here, I'll pull that over. Finishing into the edge. And then I also like to use that dark blue right underneath the waves. So the waves are going to create a little bit of a shadow. And since we haven't felted this down really, really tightly yet, you can pinch it, you can move it around. So here's what I'm going to do is go underneath that turquoise and pull it along, kind of at an angle here. Right underneath it. And you can do that with the one in the distance as well. Add a little bit of a darker blue. Right there. And you can certainly add more colors into that shoreline if you want, or I was just doing a few in here, but you can add more. So spend a few minutes smoothing and just adding little pieces where maybe it was a little too thin, or you noticed a part, a section maybe needed a couple more little pieces of water, strings of water. And then especially going back in through the main body of water here, you might want to use that multi-needle tool to speed it up a little bit. Smoothing it down. Right. So the last part is to use this nice bright white bamboo top, and this is where creating the edge of the water is really going to make it look like the shoreline. So twist it a little bit here, and then just like we did before, you're going to start on the very edge and stick it down. And then weave it kind of up and down. It's okay if it frays a little bit like that. I mean, the water just does its own thing, and we want this nice clear edge here, right below where that orange had started. And then I'm going to make it a little thicker down here where the wave is closer to your perspective, like if you were standing right here in the sand, you would see it closer up right here. So I pulled it around and bunched it up a little bit there. And then if you want to, you can take very, very fine pieces and add them in here, and sometimes it's easier with the multi-needle tool to spread them out. So places where the water had just been and it's still receding. And you can overlap those pieces a little bit. There we go. And then you can do that as well into the edge of the water here. So I can do a few and then kind of smooth them out a little bit. Add as many as you want to in here. Pulling at an angle towards the wave. The other main thing to do is to take some of that white and put it at the very top edge of the biggest wave that's right in front. So right on top of the turquoise. Kind of guiding it up and down, squiggling it around. It's kind of fun just to not work in straight lines sometimes and just let it let it do its thing. So that the top of the wave is the brightest. And you can do that again in the distance if you'd like to. Or maybe add a little more underneath the sun. You can go back to that nice lavender color that we started with and add a little more along the edge here because it's catching the lavender from the top of the sky right up there. So adding some of that, and it helps to smooth it out too a little bit and makes it a softer look between all those pieces of bamboo top and silk. So little bits of purple, and then if you want to, like if you wanted a more dramatic edge to your piece, and maybe this white here was a little thicker in places, what adds a nice touch is a little bit of a darker color right underneath it. Like there's a shadow underneath that foam that's coming up on the shore. So I like to use either the brown or even a little bit of that dark blue that we were using before. And guide it right underneath the edge for that shadow effect. And then I think in my example here, I had a little bit more of this turquoise color that came through in a couple waves, and I think it looks best if you don't keep all of them going the same direction. If you let some of them wiggle out to the side, or maybe even like right along the shoreline here, and then pull it around. And I did cover up a little bit of that orange, so you can always add a little more orange in there too. That orange is a really fun color that you can put right along the sand here. So then continue smoothing that out for as long as you want to keep all the fibers tucked down tightly. And use your single needle to dig into the edges and catch any loose fibers and get that looking a little more refined in through here. I even like to take the edge of my needle and go almost horizontally into the very edge of the water here. And then you'll just be tucking those stray pieces over onto the back side, just like we did before. So pull them over and stab those down just to clean up that edge. So at this point you can go back in and add any little refinements that you'd like. Like I've decided to add a little bit more dark blue over here just to show that that side was a little cloudier, a little darker in the sky, and I think that adds some really nice contrast over here along the right side. So take little pieces of that dark blue and move your needle horizontally, and it almost will create little waves in the distance like that. If you're like me and you like to just keep tweaking and poking at things and maybe add a little more color here and there, I think I'd like to add a little more yellow in the water underneath that bright yellow cloud that we have going on in this piece. And if you'd like to make that second wave a little bit bigger, and you can always go back and just layer it, which is so nice about this medium, is that you can just keep adding onto it and tweaking it and adding pieces, and there we go. So maybe just a little more yellow under the sky, under the sun. And then just keep smoothing it until you're happy with how tightly it's been felted. With your multi-needle tool or your clover pen, we'll come back and see the finished piece. Here is our completed piece, and they all turn out so differently, but this one I just love how the blue wave in front that is very prominent, and the silk in the sky really catches the eye. And if you really want to, you can take the scissors and kind of trim up any of the edges that got a little fuzzy, but I can also show you some of the other variations that have been done of this piece. So this one here had more of an orange sky. I pulled a little more white silk and orange into the water here, but otherwise very similar through the water. And then this third piece, it's fun to see them all lined up. This one kind of had a darker, moodier sky going on, more yellow in the sky, but that's what's fun, is that you can go back in and add some layers to the clouds later if you wanted to add some of that onion color or other dark purples or anything in the sky, like pieces that kind of come forward. And some of these also have a little more dark blue into the edge as well on that side, but they're fun to play around with and always come up with something a little different. Thank you so much for joining me and for trying this beach scene. I hope you had a lot of fun, and hopefully it encouraged you to try some new materials while you're needle felting and try some new techniques and recreate any other sunsets that really bring you feelings of hope and peace. So please tag LivingFelt in any of your creations, or tag me. I can't wait to see what you create.